Okay, Mr. Gerber here again. So today what we are looking at is regions, and we're going to talk very, very briefly about culture. So in the previous video, we talked more about latitude and longitude. We talked about the definition of like a site and a place with toponyms. So this is kind of an extension of that idea of place, situation, and site within the idea of what is a region, and then culture is going to play into this as well. And the idea of regions comes in obviously very much throughout the idea of just geography itself, in terms of ethnicity, political geography, cultural geography, things like that. And obviously, as I said, the word culture in there, but also ethnicity ties into culture as well as a bunch of other things. So you're going to see kind of the very beginnings of the idea of culture. There's going to be a whole other chapter and set of units on culture itself, but we'll kind of briefly describe what that is today and how that ties in to at least the topics we're talking about here within Unit 1. All right, so that's where we're going to start off, is just the idea of regions, and we'll tie that into culture as we go. So what is a region? So the book defines a region as an area distinguished by a unique combination of trends or features that unify it. So it has to be more than just one feature, because typically one thing doesn't define a region more than anything else. So you need a variety of factors. So it has to be something that makes an area unique. Like, what if we said, what makes Minnesota more unique than North and South, than North Dakota? And if you just said the weather, well, that's not entirely true. We have very similar climates and locations, with the exception of maybe the number of lakes within there. So you could say the size of lakes or the number of lakes compared to Minnesota or North Dakota. But you also would say you have to find other things related to that, or that would make it different between Minnesota and North Dakota. So regions are unified by a cultural landscape. And again, definition coming right out of the book here. All right, that's a combination of cultural features such as language and religion, economic features like agriculture and industry, and then physical features like climate and vegetation that shape an area of the earth. So when you mix in things like this is where you get something that makes a place unique, when you throw a combination of those things in there based on these variety of features. So kind of we see here in the top right corner, we see hillside farming. In the bottom left, we see a McDonald's, but it's not in English, okay? And then down here, we get a mixture of a sign. So this is in Quebec within Canada, where they speak both French and English, though French is predominant in the Quebec region of Canada and Montreal. All right, the French-Canadian idea. And then even here in Minnesota, we have the unique architecture of US Bank Stadium, all right, to kind of look like a Viking shape, to kind of go back to that, Scandinavian heritage within Minnesota that makes it more unique than, or can make it a different region and more distinctive than just Quebec, which has more of a French characteristic and background, right? Even though they might have very similar cultures and agricultural practices, those are, again, unique defining features, all right, that separate a region. So the kind of a short version of that is a visible reflection of the culture within the built environment. How did humans impact the land to make it distinctive from other areas? Okay, and culture can strengthen or weaken regional ties. So you have to also think about what brings people together, but also what breaks people apart or keeps them from being united. All right, so culture can bring people together, but can also prevent people from, finding stronger bonds within a community. So keep that in mind. So when we talk about Minnesota, and if we had more time in class, we would definitely have this discussion of, if we said Minnesota was part of a region, what region would that be? So keep that in mind as we go forward here. So think about what that is, but also what cultural, economic, and environmental factors about Minnesota leads us to thinking that Minnesota belongs to a certain region. And does all of Minnesota belong to the same region in all categories? Are all the economic factors of Minnesota the same throughout the state? Are all the cultural factors of Minnesota the same? What about the environment? Is it the same everywhere? All right. What makes Minnesota different from the northeastern part of the country? What about the Southwest? How is the metro area different from the other parts of the state? So this is why we talk about, separation of culture, because it varies even within a given location, all right, depending on the size and scope of what we're looking at. So the actual types of regions, in terms of what we talk about here with human geography. So the very first type is what we call a formal or uniform region. Those terms are interchangeable with formal or uniform. Okay, and this is where the majority of people share one or more distinctive characteristics that can include things like where you legally live or other distinctive features. All right, so what characteristics are unique to Minnesota? So think about, what is it that comes to mind when people say Minnesota? What is it they think of? So just take a couple seconds there to think about that. All right, and we're going to look at kind of some examples of things that make Minnesota distinctive, but does it, again, continue to make it more distinctive than other places in the area. All right, so some things that I've come up with, and again, if we were in class, we would do a little more bigger breakdown of this. All right, so the idea culturally, most Minnesotans, at least historically and still predominantly, are Christian in some way, shape, or form. Okay, and most Minnesotans, to a large extent, speak English. All right, not everyone, but that, again, that is a lot of the shared cultural features within Minnesota. Also, in terms of culture, following Minnesota laws, and then we also got the Minnesota Nice, oh sure you betcha, passive-aggressive Minnesota stance. That's kind of what Minnesota Nice stands for. Okay, economics, what ties Minnesota together, makes us unique, is a variety of things that we're known for. So iron ore, all right, especially when we talk up here in northern Minnesota. Corn within a lot of the farming in Minnesota. And then also medical devices is one of the big tech things that Minnesota is known for. So when we talk about agriculture also playing a major impact in there, we also have really big agricultural businesses, not just farms, but also ties into things, and I'm blanking on the big company that's in Hopkins that's just based there. I just ran past it the other day. I honestly can't think of it off the top of my head. Cargill, that's it. Yeah, Cargill is pretty big, but there are, you know, a lot of other major companies too. But medical devices is kind of one of the bigger things that Minnesota is known for economically in terms of our design and development. Environmentally, we think cold, we think the snow. We also think of really just having more than 10,000 lakes within the state of Minnesota. Again, these are things that make Minnesota distinct, or what people think of when they think the culture of Minnesota. Okay, now not every person has to fully agree with or follow these shared features, but it, to a large extent, exists either in the mindset or legitimately exists within Minnesota and how we understand it. Okay, but again, are these things similar throughout the entirety of the state to make it a formal region? All right, because you can break this down based on other characteristics within a given part of the state. All right, so looking again at this 2012 election map, okay, well, if you look, Minnesota predominantly is Democrat, especially when it comes to the presidential election. But again, not everyone in the state is a Democrat or a liberal, okay? More metropolitan areas, or areas that have, again, larger concentrations of people, typically tend to vote more Democratic versus Republican. Republican is more rural. So, you know, we got the Twin Cities up here, Duluth. You know, you get little factors within, you know, Rochester, within Austin and Albert Lee, Fargo, Moorhead, you know, typically tend to be more Democratic. But also, so are areas with high labor areas, historically, not always, but historically. Okay, farmers, and again, we said more rural areas tend to be more Republican. But again, that's not necessarily true. So we got to keep those things in mind. Religion, we talked about that. So if you get a chance, take a look at this more in depth. Within that religious composition of Minnesota. We're going to not talk about this too much, but again, take a look at it, because this is, again, something that someone came up with in terms of the 6 real regions of Minnesota, of how we break down the state, and things that would, again, strengthen or maybe tear apart people, or I shouldn't say tear apart, but keep people from necessarily feeling united within these given parts of the state, within these 6 different characteristics, or how these things might unify the people within these 6 different regions, but also may not necessarily keep Minnesota whole based on the differences and things that define them as characteristics within the given areas compared to the state. So the second regional type is what we call the functional or nodal region. Again, interchangeable, can use both terms. Area organized around a focal or nodal point. So something that, you know, ties it together based on some sort of action, some sort of group that kind of dominates the region at the central area, and the further away you get from it, the more likely you are not to use it and kind of get isolated from it. So this relates mostly to economics more than anything else, and we'll show you some examples here. So boundary established by the furthest extent of the customers or the furthest extent of the business when you talk about you know, the economic side. So prior to DoorDash, maybe this still applies to DoorDash. I've only used it like once or twice, and it's been pretty local and close. But food delivery, okay? Typically, you will call up a place and say, hey, can I get this delivered? And they say, oh, well, you might be too far away based on, you know, our limits. You're too far out of the zone. You got to call somebody else, or sorry, we can't give you our business, but you could definitely come and pick it up, but we won't deliver because you're too far away. Or local TV receptions. So these are local TV markets. So every time the color changes is typically when you're going to get a change in, you know, whose local broadcast or local news and local TV stations are you going to get. So this blue one here covers most of Minnesota, but also you see that we get different kinds. So we get Rochester down here in southern Minnesota, also La Crosse and the Quad Cities down here in northern Iowa. Up in the north, up around Duluth, we get the Fargo-Moorhead one, and I got a buddy who actually works as a producer at the Fargo-Moorhead stations. I don't remember which one, but a local one. So essentially, this blue area is going to cover Fox 9, WCCO, KARE 11, and all the other local channels. But the further out you go into these other areas, you're probably not going to get them on TV. So if you ever go to the hotels and you wonder, like, well, I'm only over here, why does it change? There's your focal and nodal point. There's the extent and the change. Okay, Federal Reserve banks, where do we keep money and spread that out within, reserve money within the United States? Are these locations? And again, they're not necessarily always central locations because, number 9, puts it here in North and South Dakota, but it's actually based here in Minneapolis. So again, trying to cover certain regions. All right, but another really great example is school districts. All right, so here are all the metropolitan districts within the kind of Twin Cities and Twin Cities suburbs. Here's ISD 199, that's us here in Inver Grove. And so again, the extent of the boundaries is that functional region or nodal region. Okay, so the third type is the vernacular or perceptual region. Okay, this is an area that people believe exists as part of their cultural identity. So again, tying that into the idea of culture. So it comes from that sense of place where we belong rather than any scientific model. Phone's ringing behind me, so I'll have to answer that here in a second. But we're going to continue with the video. So what states constitute the Midwest? So again, thinking, what do we perceive the Midwest to actually be? All right, so you ask different people from different parts of the country, you're going to get different answers. I look at this and I see, Pennsylvania and West Virginia. I don't necessarily, as myself as a Minnesotan, think of Pennsylvania and West Virginia as part of the Midwest. But again, it depends on who you talk to. I wouldn't necessarily think Kentucky fits in that either, but it varies. Oklahoma, I could see that. Arkansas, I don't really interpret that as being part, again, of the Midwest. But again, it all depends on where you come from. So again, thinking of that perceptual and vernacular region, I think I jumped the gun here. Yeah, I went too far back. The 6 real regions of Minnesota, these might be more perceptual than anything else based on something that someone came up with. All right, there might be some defining characteristics, but is that actually true about Minnesota? And do these people feel like these are actual different regions? Because I look at this thing with Iron Range and the North Shore. I would think that Hermantown, Duluth, Cloquet fit within the Iron Range, but also they are along the Lake Superior. So how do you play that off? So again, these are just kind of things to think about within that. Okay. Now, tying this in with culture, so our definition of culture, and this is something we are going to come back to a lot throughout the entirety of the course once we get to the actual chapter on culture, then the unit kind of talking about religion, language, going beyond that. So culture as a definition, body of customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits that together constitute a group's distinct tradition. So we look at this based on where people are culturally, where their characteristics describe where cultural groups are, and why they are located in those certain areas. So again, think about looking at that 6 regions in Minnesota. All right, culture is a big part of why that person drew the map where it was based on things that are very much specific cultural traits or similar traits within a large body of those groups of people living there. Okay, it's important because it shapes the way that we use and interact with the physical environment, making areas unique based on housing, based on types of jobs, what we find important. Think about churches, think about schools, where's the money going, parks, recreation. It's all going to tie into what is important to a cultural group, whether that is, again, related to religion, cultural heritage, a sense of community within, a given country, breaking down those other barriers, or propping barriers up. Okay, so most people think how culture plays a role in what we think our regions are. Okay, similar region based on European settlers that were there, country of origin, appearance, religious beliefs, types of jobs, what they eat, types of clothes they wear. Okay, culture kind of extends beyond that, and again ties into what we think a region is mentally when we tie all this in together. So again, more based not on the physical boundaries like what we talk about with a formal region, but more about the cultural traits within our perceptual or vernacular. Okay, so one thing to continually think about here is also not only what brings people together within its cultural region, an identity, but also what breaks that down. And we'll stop there and we'll continue on with the next video going into section 3.